it's at the moment the tactical consideration that this has come forward just at the moment when things look like they might start moving in Israel. And Benny Gantz, who's in the coalition with Netanyahu, had just said, unless Israel starts to have a political strategy, not just a military one for Gaza, he would leave the government by June the 8th, and that would sort of break the logjam in Israeli politics. And it's possible this move by the ICC delays that, cuts across that, rallies support for Netanyahu, at least in the short term. So if I was the foreign secretary, I wouldn't, if I was still the foreign secretary, I wouldn't really be welcoming of this intervention when things might just have started to improve.
Kezia, I feel very deflated and depressed today, even more so than normal, because I do worry that we live in a country where cover-up, defensiveness, protecting yourself at the expense of ordinary people, as Andrew Neil was talking about, is absolutely woven into the very the weft and warp of our existence. This is what institutionality in this country is based on: defensiveness and cover up, and there's no hope of getting out of that. What do you think?
I think well said, Stick. It certainly feels like this is writ large at the moment. What I would say, though, is, my overwhelming feeling, having read these absolutely horrendous stories and experiences of what people have endured for decades, is a degree of gratefulness that we do have this public inquiry system. And we've met many times on this programme and derided it for the length of time that these things take, for the cost involved. But actually, on a day like today, you do see its value as the one way people can take on the power structures and the hierarchical systems in this country that have enforced so much injustice on people. There's just something in that to hold on to today.
Unless, though, a point that occurred to me earlier is that the public inquiry system, this is a very good public inquiry, is part of the problem. Because what we do in this country is we delay, we set up a public inquiry. That itself becomes part of the long grass into which these issues fall. And we know that this morning, many of the people who've made these decisions will be dead. Many of these people, much more concerningly, who've been subject to these decisions will be dead. And therefore, this process that seems to take decades rather than weeks is actually part of the problem.
Oh, of course. Well, I don't know if it's part of the problem, because it's a tiny bit of the solution. It's not the ideal way to approach this by any stretch of the imagination, right? But what type of conversation would we be having this morning if that inquiry didn't exist? Would we be talking about this at all? I think it's possible to say, we're glad that we have this inquiry system. It could be a whole lot better than it actually is, and there's lots of things to discuss around that. But at the root of this is a power imbalance in the country where people who experience an injustice feel completely unable to raise it and be heard anywhere else within the system, whether that's in the justice system, the health system, local government, and any other aspects of their lives. This has been a last chance saloon when it comes to this inquiry. But what we're seeing here is a little bit of justice being done, or the beginnings of it. Obviously, the next stage is what happens with the compensation, how quickly people can access that. And I think there's a whole other conversation about how that can be regulated, so that we don't have to have a new process every time a justice has been done, and then we have to start working out how you compensate people financially, let alone for every other aspect of what they've endured.
William, how do we change the culture of a country when it comes to institutions? Because there is a defensiveness, there is a reluctance to accept the responsibility, there is a fear of being held accountable, which actually means people avoid accountability rather than stopping problems at the beginning. How bad do you think institutional defensiveness is in this country, and how do we fix it, do you think, William?
It's bad. It's probably been getting a little better in recent years. There's now things like the Freedom of Information Act where people can request documents. And I think if that had been in force back in the 70s and 80s, when the infected blood scandal got going, there would have been much more published about it at an earlier stage. It partly relies on one thing I've always been in favor of in the civil service, which is people staying in their jobs for longer so that you can hold them to account. Because what happens on like a big infrastructure project and on like HS2, as well as on an absolutely tragic thing like this, is people do a couple of years in their jobs, and so they know they're going to move on before anybody really focuses on what might be going wrong in their area. That doesn't incentivize people to say, excuse me, there is a problem here. So I think all of those things would help. And then there is learning the lessons from this, because, you know, the lesson of this, if you are a minister, when you're signing that letter that the officials have prepared for you that says there's no problem here, it's difficult because you may have 200 letters in front of you in the evening, and which ones do you focus on? But this just underlines that sometimes you have to question that answer and say, I smell a rat here. There is something about this explanation that's not right. Ministers often do that, but they probably have to do it even more than they've been doing it, certainly in this case.
Is that a civil service problem then?
Well, yes, it is partly whether there's a culture of openness or not, what you were asking about. Because one of the interesting things, of the many interesting and damning things in this report, is that it says there wasn't actually a group of people sitting in a room having a conspiracy to the president. It was a more pervasive thing, a more cultural thing, out of the whole system really refusing to accept that there was a problem. And so that is down to culture. It might also be down to individuals, but it is predominantly down to a culture of not wanting to bring up an inconvenient problem. And you do see that in all governments, in all bureaucracies. So all you can do is tackle that with the culture.
William, I'm really interested in kind of, you know, your and you've touched upon it already, your kind of recollection of the time. I quickly had to Google Conservative leader 1997 to 2001, Foreign Secretary 2010 to 2014. Hopefully I've got that right. So you were kind of part of the, you know, political class, especially as Foreign Secretary. The Blood inquiry, public inquiry, was not ordered until 2017. So you were kind of around in the kind of the last days of there not being an inquiry. Can you remember if you had any conversations, how aware you were of what was going on, and did you first of all, do you recognise the some people characterise it as very much of a quite paternalistic, we know best kind of thing, and these people are just a bit crazy and a bit conspiracy theorist and all the rest of it? And secondly, did you recognise a changing in attitudes throughout that time?
Well, I can't be very helpful on that because I wasn't aware of it at all in those positions. It didn't, as Foreign Secretary, you don't. This is not something that you deal with at all.
But it wouldn't have been discussed at cabinet at any point. No, it wasn't.
No, you see, that is actually the problem in a way, because if it was known to be a sufficient issue that it came to the cabinet, well, then, you know, you would have you'd have a big discussion about it. A lot of members of the cabinet would say, "Come on, there's something not right here."
Yeah. So it wasn't cutting through at that point. That's interesting.
It doesn't come to that level, not in my recollection anyway. I remember as an MP during the time I was Foreign Secretary actually bringing up other problems, like it's not on as big a scale as this, but Lariam was a drug being used at the Ministry of Defense against malaria that was having very bad effects on soldiers, and I was one of the MPs who brought that up.
Yeah.
And actually, after a couple of letters to the Ministry of Defense, they started to say maybe there is a problem here, and then since then, you know, they've changed all of that. So it is important to remember that too. There are cases where things are brought up and the people in charge say, okay, yes, we recognize there's something not right here. That happens a lot as well. But that's, you know, you don't end up with the public inquiry into that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't learn from all the cases that go wrong. And this one is the worst I can ever think of. The whole time I've been aware of government. But, you know, there are a lot of good ministers out there in all parties who do spot problems, and we shouldn't forget that when we discuss this.
Yeah. Let's move on and talk about the International Criminal Court. The chief prosecutor there has applied for arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the leaders of Hamas, accusing them of war crimes. ICC judges will decide if there is enough evidence to issue the arrest warrant, so they've not been issued yet. Meanwhile, the US President Joe Biden has called the ICC prosecutors' move outrageous. A prominent Israeli politician told us that the ICC prosecutors' actions were like comparing Hitler to Churchill. Kezia, do you think that's right? Hitler to Churchill?
No, not at all. I think this is a very welcome move. And the way that I look at it is by looking at what those war crimes are, what those charges are described as. And when you're talking about the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willful killing, and internationally directing attacks against the civilian population, intentionally, directing attacks against the civilian population, then I'm afraid I feel like I've seen plenty of evidence that Israel's government has committed that, just as I see evidence that Hamas has committed those acts. So the equivalence argument is separate. It's whataboutery. These are two separate entities that, in my mind, can easily be charged with these accusations, and that's what the ICC has done.
The Israeli politician that we spoke to, Fleur Noum Hassan, she deputy mayor of Jerusalem, she said that first of all, she felt that civilians in places like Rafah are given enough warning to move out of danger. She does say that there have been problems with humanitarian issues, but her point really was that it's a war and terrible things happen when war is on, Kezia.
Yes, and we call them war crimes and they're illegal. So that's why this is absolutely right and just. There's a second conversation to be had about the timing of it and the implications that has on the ability to secure a ceasefire and all the kind of tactical arguments that flow from that. But if you're going to take a principled judgment on whether or not the Israeli government and Hamas have separately committed crimes as described there, then I think the evidence is pretty clear and pretty apparent that all the ICC are doing here is the job that we've tasked them to do.
William Hague, there are plenty of people who are uncomfortable with these two individuals, organizations being put together in the same category. So arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and the leaders of Hamas. But if we were to put that to one side, could it be argued that there may be evidence of war crimes on both sides?
Well, it can be argued that there would be an argument about it, as you were just quoting the Israeli spokesman who would say, well, it's not war crimes. We are defending ourselves. That definitely there's grounds to argue in both directions about that. I would be among those who are uncomfortable with bracketing them together. The Israeli ministers are the elected leaders of and I'm often a critic of them, but they are the elected leaders of a democratic state that was attacked. And that is different from being a terrorist organization that launches an attack. So I would be among those uncomfortable. But could there be an argument? Yes. My main problem with it is Kezia just mentioned it, actually. It's at the moment the tactical consideration that this has come forward just at the moment when things look like they might start moving in Israel. And Benny Gantz, who's in the coalition with Netanyahu, had just said, unless Israel starts to have a political strategy, not just a military one for Gaza, he would leave the government by June the 8th, and that would sort of break the logjam in Israeli politics. And it's possible this move by the ICC delays that, cuts across that, rallies support for Netanyahu, at least in the short term. So if I was the foreign secretary, if I was still the foreign secretary, I wouldn't really be welcoming of this intervention when things might just have started to improve.
Yeah. Now, this is a very theoretical question and it would never happen. But if you were foreign secretary today and the ICC says, yes, we're going to issue arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and the leaders of Hamas are not likely to visit here. Neither is Benjamin Netanyahu. He's pretty busy right now. But if he were to set foot on British soil and the arrest warrant had been issued, what would happen then?
Well, you are then bound by the internet. We are signatories in this country to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So you are then bound to make an arrest. But of course, like anything, lawyers can argue about that and whether some measure of diplomatic immunity arises. But you would not, I think it would be highly unlikely that somebody who's actually subject to an ICC warrant, this is the prosecutor calling for that at the moment rather than the judge issuing that. It's highly unlikely that they would set foot in any of the 124 countries that are in the ICC, including the UK, because there would be a very high risk of being arrested.